So it's fallen to me for the last 5 or 6 years, and I'm delighted that it has, to perform the kind of Roald Dahl or Alfred Hitchcock Presents role at the annual David Ogilvy lecture. This year, I have a particular treat in introducing you to a speaker, someone who has perhaps more in common with David Ogilvy than anyone before. Not only in that they both were proudly and openly Scottish, but also in the fact that perhaps the speaker today has a career path and a kind of course of life which makes David Ogilvy's look straightforward. David Ogilvy was famously variously a failed tobacco farmer among the Amish, an Arga salesman, a chef, a possible but never confirmed MI6 operative, before he even entered advertising in his 40s. And as David Ogilvy remarked, who on earth in the advertising industry would ever have hired someone with that CV today? What's remarkable about today's speaker is he's done just as great a range of things, but he seems to have managed to have done them in parallel, including being the co-creator of some of my favorite films, the rescuer and creator of a spectacularly valuable whiskey brand, a writer, a company director, and a trade union officer at the same time. But I think it's probably safe to say that you'll know that he's also the screenwriter of the great series on Netflix called The Queen's Gambit.
Men are gonna come along and want to teach you things. Doesn't make them any smarter. You just let them blow by, and you go on ahead and do just what and how you feel like.
And The Queen's Gambit, along with another of his productions, in fact, which he co-wrote, which is Priscilla, Queen of the Desert. What I particularly love about these films is that they came from absolutely nowhere. And they reinforce a point about creativity, which I keep having to make time and time again. If you had gone to anybody sane, to be absolutely honest, including me, since I'm kind of a secret chess hater, and said, why on earth is it that nobody's ever made a kind of film that centers around chess? I would have given you 100 good reasons why it would be a disaster. That it's an incredibly niche interest, it's impossible to portray on screen. I would have probably reeled off 10 or 15 reasons why making any kind of drama that centers on the chess world was doomed to failure. In the same way that I think all of us can imagine about 20 reasons why Priscilla, Queen of the Desert, was not likely to be highly successful cinema when it was simply described to us. And that strikes me as the magic of creativity. Good ideas work just the way you expect, but great ideas work in all kinds of ways you never could have predicted. And this is a point I'd like to make, and a generalizable point I'd like to make about marketing. And the reason you need creativity in marketing, the reason that creativity is not actually an optional extra in marketing, it's an absolute essential, is this. Fundamentally, there are more good ideas you can post-rationalize than there are good ideas you can pre-rationalize. It's also true of the majority of scientific discoveries. Most scientific discoveries, just like most marketing breakthroughs, don't happen through absolutely rational induction, looking at what you already know and logically extrapolating from it. So I think we're in danger of making a terrible mistake in marketing in general, not just in marcoms, which is in a desperate effort to appear scientific in the face of accountants, we're actually discarding one of the most important aspects of any scientific process, which is what Conan Doyle called reasoning backwards, and what the great 19th century logician Charles Sanders Peirce called abductive inference. There is no logical sequential process which will get you to the idea that a film featuring a lot of cross-dressing males driving through the Australian desert in a bus is going to be a huge success. There's no absolutely surefire, rational, sequential, deductive process by which you can say that a Netflix series that's centered around chess is going to be the most popular thing of the whole year and watched by over 60 million people. Those processes don't exist. The only way you can do that in science and in marketing is through abductive inference, which is, broadly speaking, you reason backwards. You either say, this thing we've noticed is very strange, what might the reason for it be? That's effectively what Darwin did. These finches have strange shaped beaks. What might the conditions have been that caused this to pertain? That's what Fleming did when he noticed that all the bacteria had died around some blobs of fungus in a petri dish. But it requires a hypothesis. It requires an act of imagination, and there's no way, first of all, of actually performing that function without recourse to the imagination. Furthermore, the means by which we hypothesize, and this is known as Polanyi's paradox, aren't fully known to us. It's something you can't really replicate in AI or with a computer. And so my great contention is this fear of deploying subjective tacit skill in marketing is often undertaken with the aim of making us look scientific. It's actually profoundly unscientific as an approach. All good science has to start with an imagined hypothesis, with a creative act, or with a piece of reverse reasoning. I've often said that I think artificial intelligence is the wrong thing to look for in marketing. What we want is artificial inquisitiveness. We need algorithms to float around that notice the strangest things our customers do, so we can try and work out what's going on. And so what really excites me here is that I think we'd actually be much more creative in marketing if we got better at science. But we need to get better at the right kind of science, and we need to be comfortable using these kind of tacit skills like imagination and hypothesization, which we always become awkward and defensive about simply because they seem so subjective. They're subjective because they can be nothing else. And so, as I said, who would have thought these films would have been successful? Nobody. There's absolutely no data to support it because all big data comes from the same place, the past. If you want to do something dramatically new, it's impossible to do that only looking at the information from previous outcomes without imagining different future worlds. The future is much, much more long-tailed than the past, and therefore it needs much more exploratory thought than we're currently giving it. And so I think this is a wonderful guest because his entire life seems to be spent somehow successfully persuading people, including the people who hold the purse strings, to invest in projects which have a high degree of creativity and abductive influence. Why is that important? As I said, there are far more good ideas you can post-rationalize than there are good ideas you can pre-rationalize. And if you confine yourself to experimenting only in the areas that make sense in advance, you're only exploring about 10% of the solution space. Dyson didn't make any sense in advance. Red Bull didn't make any sense in advance. It's fair to say that Nespresso didn't make any sense in advance. Most really successful brands weren't asked for in advance. No one was wandering around before Starbucks and saying, why can't I pay $4.30 for a cup of coffee and then wander around holding it in a paper cup? No one ever said before Turkish barbers came along, I really like my current hairdresser, but I just wish he'd flick burning methylated spirits into my ears. There are things you can only discover by doing them or by trying them. If you want to get scientific about this, this is called the explore-exploit trade-off. And whatever you do, you must never do only exploitation without exploration. That's every bit as foolish as doing it 100% the other way around. So I'm overcome with awe and admiration in introducing the speaker we have for you today, who seems to have perfected more than anyone else I can imagine that art of getting rational people, the very people who hold the purse strings, to fund projects which at first glance, through the lens of strict deductive rationality, seem to make absolutely no sense at all. Ladies and gentlemen, let me pass over to Sophie Devonshire to introduce our David Ogilvy lecturer, Mr. Allan Scott.
So, Allan, thank you so much for joining us here today.
Pleasure.
So, Allan Scott, whiskey executive, writer, producer, creator. You are a modern Renaissance man, if ever there was one. What I'd love to talk about with you here today is to understand a little bit about what makes you tick and what those of us in marketing and business can learn from what you've done across your life. But firstly, who are you? You have very early in your career rebranded yourself, changed your name, now known worldwide as Allan Scott. I'd love to hear why and how you chose that name.
Okay, I absolutely reject the term that I rebranded myself. I did not set out to sell myself in any way at all. It was that I was at university, being a good and happy student, and I was doing amusing things with somebody, actually a lecturer in the law faculty. We did sort of gigs for college things, and one day somebody came to us from the El Morocco nightclub and said, "Would you like to be paid $500 a week to do a show every night?" And $500 a week at that time was the difference in wealth and poverty to me. So I immediately said yes, and then remembered that the faculty had said to me that I wasn't allowed to do any extracurricular activity. I was supposed to be concentrating solely on my degree. And so I had to invent a name to disguise myself with. So instead of being Sheikh, I couldn't come up with anything. I went through all my family history. I went through the history of Scotland. I thought Wallace would be a good name. This was long before Mel Gibson had given us his version of how a good man dies. And I finally came upon Scott. At least it said what I was. I was a Scott. And so I took that name. And of course, what inevitably happened is the career in the entertainment field, which for me became writing, took off. And the career in the whiskey field remained quiet and discreet for some years yet to come. So I ended up being Allan Scott, the writer, and Alan Sheikh, the whiskey person. Yeah.
It's a great story because it shows very early on your perhaps a little bit of a rebellious side, but certainly the creativity that's in you to find a way through it all. When we try to introduce all you've done across your career, the whiskey executive, the marketer, the businessman, the stand-up comedian at certain points, everything you've done across the breadth of your career, it's quite hard to summarise what you've done. How do you summarise it? How would you sum up what your career has been or what you've been?
You know, when people say this to me, I never quite know how to respond. Because if you're on the inside looking out, you just do what you do. And it isn't a big jump to go from a marketing meeting with an advertising agency to a script meeting with a director and an executive at MGM. It really isn't very different. I mean, you're playing by the same rules. So for me, it's just the same thing with slightly different applications. I give you an example. In filmmaking, which is really what writers do. I mean, that's the one thing I get grumpy about in our industry, is that all credit is given to the director. And it's nonsense. I mean, it's not a Sophie Devonshire picture, even if you make it as the director. It's a Sophie Devonshire picture written by Allan Scott, designed by so-and-so, edited by somebody. It's really a collaborative effort. The director is supposed ideally to bring all the collaborations together. But The Guardian and many other newspapers now are so lazy that they talk about things as being a Martin Scorsese picture. I could show you 2 Martin Scorsese pictures. You would never guess that he directed them. It's just nonsense. What does it mean?
It's the full collaboration of the team and of course the writer. So
and there's a huge amount of collaboration in both, certainly in marketing, as you will know, and advertising, and in making movies. It's the same kind of collaboration. You have to identify the weak and avoid them. You have to particularly identify the really good and skillful and encourage them, and spot the difference between the two. Sometimes the hardest job of all.
Yeah. No, I can absolutely see that in both careers, finding the right talent and identifying it makes a big difference. Now, I know you made the decision to move from Scotland to Canada to go to McGill. And while they're working on the newspaper, I guess you were also spotting some writing talent while you were there.
Well, I didn't really. That wasn't my task. The first year I was at university, I was made the features editor of a daily newspaper. I don't know how many universities have daily newspapers. No. Entirely published by the students, a circulation of about 30,000, and 8 pages of news relevant to the university and the world. So it was kind of fun because you were right there, dealing with who's the next president and that kind of stuff at the same time as all other newspaper tasks. And my favorite claim to fame at that time was that I had to publish a poem written by a student once a week. And I did that in all honesty, reading them and choosing the one I liked best. And one time, I chose the same poet for about 6 episodes or 8 episodes. I really can't remember, 8 editions. And thought no more about it until I was summoned by the board of the newspaper to be dressed down, because I had published poetry by somebody who was no longer a student at McGill. They had been, but they'd left, and they were now just submitting it because it was somebody to get your poetry printed. I didn't know that they'd left. Anyway, I published during that time the poetry of somebody called Leonard Cohen.
Brilliant.
And if I could sing on this interview, I would. Hallelujah.
So brilliant. I mean, and the ability to spot that talent and nurture it.
It's not that difficult when you see the competition.
I love this. And after your time at McGill, you then spent a lot of time in TV, looking at it, working as a writer for US and UK TV, but also these 2 parts of your life together at the same time, serving as a non-exec director at Macallan.
Yes.
You then took over as chair.
Yeah.
Talk to us about what the situation was when you took over at chair.
Well, the situation was, it was just at the time when 12 years previously, we had planned to produce enough whiskey to set out and try and market it as a single malt. And that takes 10 to 12 years for most whiskey brands who are concerned with their quality. And it's a huge financial commitment, because what you're doing is you're paying all the staff to make this single product that you store away in a warehouse in barrels. And it's an incredibly important part of the process. You can't not do it. And I've often said to people, it's like opening a restaurant, hiring all the staff, buying all the food, and then not letting any customer into your restaurant for a decade. It's that mad. And yet, in the long haul, of course, it's highly valuable. So I took over at just the time when my potential talent as a marketeer had no recognition at all. I just thought I might do it. But I said to the board, look, I will do it. I'll be the chairman, but only for 6 months or a year. And at the end of that, when you see how feeble I am, you'll want somebody else to come in and start selling the brand. And within weeks, I knew and everybody else knew that I was quite good at this job. I don't know why. I'm sure it was mostly to do with the ability to spot the right people and have a terrific team around you. I mean, I had a really good team. Our marketing director was previously the marketing director of one of the most distinguished brands. Our managing director was, he once proved to me his greatness as a managing director. I said, have you seen, there's a huge piece of plastic in the tree outside the main office building. And he said, yes, I was waiting to see if I did nothing about it, who would remove it. And I said, oh, that's interesting. He said, I removed it this morning. You won't see it there any longer. And the moment somebody says that to you, you know that in terms of their management skills, that's a high management. Anyway, so I had this terrific team, and I enjoyed the job. I mean, I really did, which was mainly at that time coming up with an advertising campaign based on a budget that you would be lucky to buy a cup of coffee with. It turned out that although I hadn't had a long life at that point, I had got good at working with people who were creative and helping them to be more creative. I was good with ideas, and I love the advertising industry generally. It crosses over with PR, but it's not nearly as much work, and it's much more rewarding. But going back to what I said earlier, that we have so little money to spend on advertising and public relations, that we had to be very inventive and clever with it. And the first thing we did was we negotiated, or one of the advertising people negotiated, a prime position on the Times, which at those days had a crossword on the back page every day. And we got our rather quirky ads literally right next to the crossword. So we knew we were attracting attention of the important people in life, partly because the ads were quite amusing and people kept writing in with additions to them. And we had to write to them all saying, I'm very sorry, but we only do ads that are true stories. We don't invent things to make. And they were crazy. Things like we had an ad that we had to verify from a vet who said he was called to Antibes to visit a sick whale. And he said, I examined the whale, and he said, and then the last day I gave it a half bottle of Macallan. It recovered complete health. Now, I mean, it's a sort of mad advertisement. At the time, you wouldn't see a single whiskey brand saying something like that about it. They just wouldn't do it. We took a double-page ad in one of the trade magazines that gave a short quote about its brand, and there was something like 80 of them. We made ours exactly the same as the other 79. It wasn't made to stand out in any way. I think it may have had a tick against it or something discreet. And all it said was the Rolls Royce of malts, quoting some eminent source. And I love the fact that we took on 79 other brands. So anyway, we were very discreet with our advertising, but it was very entertaining. So that, and then on the public relations side, we had a wonderful publicity lady who made me eat out twice a week, usually with somebody who would write a bit about wine or spirits. So we at least get their attention. I mean, we were unknown in 1978, and we were quite widely known by 1980. So that was the first job, was simply to say, here we are.
I mean, it's a phenomenal turnaround.
But once you've done that, you then have to follow it up.
Yeah.
You have to augment your campaigns. You have to go to different countries and test whether their markets will be receptive to that kind of campaign. My favorite Macallan ad was not a true story. And it was the only one I consciously let through as an untrue story. But I simply liked it. This chap wrote and said, I went into a bar and the barman said, he said, welcome, welcome, what can I give you? And I said, I'll have a Macallan. So the barman gave me a Macallan, and I drank it and turned to leave. And he said, excuse me, you haven't paid yet. He said, but when I came in, you said, can I give you a Macallan? And I took you at your word, and you gave me a Macallan. And he walked out. The barman shouted and screamed after him and said, if you ever darken my door again. 10 years later, I was back in the pub, same pub. And the barman looked up and he said, I've seen you before. I said, no, never been in this pub before, never. And the barman scrunched up his eyes and said, well, you must have a double. I said, yes, thank you, I'll have a Macallan. I like the story enough, and it sounds true, doesn't it?
It's a brilliant story. It's a brilliant story. And what I love about this, I mean, you focused in there on, the importance of making things entertaining, right?
Yes.
You mean, I guess the way of summing up what you have been able to do is you are in the entertainment business.
Exactly
and
so, yeah.
Advertising is part of that.
Yeah. Funny enough, I think movies, now that I'm long involved in movies, not only do you write them, you then get involved in the advertising of them as well, and the marketing of them. Mm-hmm. And movies have a very peculiar thing. They have to be marketed very fast. Their first 2 weeks are really the only important weeks to be supported by the marketing and advertising effort. And I was thinking about coming to talk to you the other day, and I thought, I must talk about movies and how they advertise themselves. I have to go off a piece of paper because I can't remember them all. But I just wrote down some of my favorite, they're called strap lines that they advertise a movie with. I made me laugh, this one. Do you remember a movie called Cocktail with Tom Cruise?
Yeah.
It was directed by a friend of mine. Anyway, the ad for cocktail was cocktail. When he pours, he rains.
I've forgotten
That's
that
so
one.
clever.
Brilliant.
Anyway, but that doesn't sell the movie. Double Indemnity, the strapline was, from the moment they met, it was murder. I love that. The Magnificent Seven, they were seven, and they fought like 700. Taxi Driver, do you remember Taxi Driver?
Classic.
Robert De Niro? On every street, in every city in this country, there's a nobody who dreams of being a somebody.
Brilliant.
It so brilliantly markets that movie and actually tells you what the story is to some extent. I like Dumb and Dumber. For Harry and Lloyd, every day is a no-brainer. That's so clever. Well, just let me pick out one or two. Well, the famous one, Close Encounters, simply said, "We are not alone." And it's like Alien. Alien said, "In space, no one can hear you scream." I mean, these are really clever advertising remarks that do the job quickly and do it and kind of entertain you. I mean, you anticipate the entertainment they have. See if I like, there's one more. Oh, of course, the famous one is not even clever or witty, it's just brilliant. Star Wars, a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. I mean, it immediately lifts it to the point of, you know you're going to see myth or a grand story, a yarn.
Yep.
And who doesn't want to see a good yarn?
I want to reference David Ogilvy here, actually, because he talked about, in the modern world of business, whatever that was for him, it is useless to be a creative, original thinker unless you can also sell what you can create. So I'd like to go back to talking about this idea of creativity. You talked about your talent for inspiring creativity when you're at Macallan and elsewhere. How do we, or how do we keep creativity alive in the boardroom, you know, in business? What can we do?
Well, you make it more successful than the guy who isn't creative. It's that simple. But like everything else in life, it's about your ability to choose well, always. I mean, marriages that endure were chosen well at the beginning and then navigated well, probably. But I can't help but think that if you've got three people in a room and one of them is an original creative thinker, that's the one I would go to and find ways to make their original creative thought work for my objectives. Now, I have different objectives to them. I've asked them to come up with a witty ad or a not a witty ad or a moving ad. And I then have to figure how do I place that.
And actually, returning to the incredible success with Macallan, I mean, the market capitalisation on the London Stock Exchange, I think, grew 200-fold under your
It was
change.
actually more than, it grew about 600-fold at one point, but it was sold at 200 times the earnings that it had when I took over, yeah.
That is phenomenal. And you started with no money, you know, no budget, so creativity on a shoestring.
Yeah.
But you talked there about the target audience. It clearly was a focus there on understanding the audience you wanted for it.
You know, you're taking a guess. I mean, obviously there's a lot of research, so you go and absorb that until it's in your bloodstream. And then I had a very strong view from the very beginning as to one of the series of ads should be placed in a certain magazine. And it was Private Eye. I said, I want to be in Private Eye. And everybody said, oh no, Private Eye is marginal. And I said, no, it's not marginal because it's read by every major opinion former in this country. And it's actually opinion formers that we were going to in the early stages. We need your boss to tell you what a good dram it is, or it's worth the extra quid in the bottle or whatever, you know. So it was a really good choice to go to Private Eye. And we spread from there, of course, and we had the Times. So, yeah, but if that creative person had come up with an ad that didn't work for us, I hope we'd have spotted it and we'd have said, no, come up with something else creative. You're a clever young gal.
But it's the idea of making those choices, whether it's the marital choice, whether it's the choosing who's on your team, or it's choosing where you want to go and where you want to be and making sure it makes it happen.
One of the things I did was I said, I know so many people in this movie business. Why don't I see if I can get product placement?
Ah.
And I have to say, within a year or two, I got the bottle featured in at least a dozen movies. I applaud my successors because they got it featured with a dialogue reference in the last but one Bond film. Now that's an accomplishment. I mean, it happened at the time to get lucky, I made a film called Don't Look Now. And Don't Look Now was, in its day, a very highly regarded movie.
Absolutely.
And it had a shocking love scene, so I'm told. I never saw the love scene, because all I saw was the bottle of Macallan on the bedside table while they were having their love scene. I was worried it was going to fall off at one point. Anyway, it didn't.
I'm interested in the fact that you've talked about truth in advertising and truth in product and getting it right. And clearly you felt strongly that you'd created a product after all the time it took you to create that product that you felt very good about.
Yeah.
Was it important then in the way in which you were communicating it to capture how great that product was?
Do you know, it's really hard to answer that question because you do what you believe. And I was, from infancy, believed that Macallan was the finest malt whiskey on Speyside. And I just sort of took it as an article of faith. There wasn't any discussion about it. What was wonderful was that by the time I came in to chair the company, all the senior executives and really everybody at the company thought it was the best whiskey. They loved the brand, they loved the story, they loved the premises, they loved everything about it. And we tried to do things that were entertaining to the employees as well as to ourselves. And when you've got that belief, it's very easy to say to other people, you know, it's a wonderful whiskey.
So Allan, the list of your writing and producing credits for successful films is phenomenal. But of course, the production which I think will resonate most with the audience watching this is your involvement in the Queen's Gambit.
Yeah.
Netflix's most successful series ever, and one that lit up so many of our lives during the horrors of lockdown.
Wasn't I lucky to have COVID going on?
You had COVID twice. Right?
I had COVID twice, and the first time I had it was the day that we started to broadcast Queen's Gambit on Netflix, so I couldn't watch it.
Well, let's talk about how that came into life. A few years ago now, what did you spot in the Walter Tevis novel that made you know that there was something here?
It was given to me by my best friend, Nicholas Roeg, the director, who was one of Britain's most eminent directors. And indeed, in a not very recent poll by one of the film magazines, the first film that I made was Nick, was Don't Look Now, and was voted the best British film ever made. I like that. I like that better than
film.
Other awards. Anyway, Nick gave me the book, and I read it and immediately knew this was a terrific movie. And so I went back to him and said, when do we start? And he said, oh no, this isn't for me. I said, what do you mean? You gave it to me for... He said, I couldn't do it. It's not... I don't know why he couldn't do it, but anyway. So anyway, I went to New York and I acquired the rights in the book. And I immediately sat down and wrote a screenplay. And I'm trying to think who my first director... I think my first director was Bernardo Bertolucci, who wanted to do it. And I kept saying, come on now, Bernardo, when are we going to sit down and work on the script and fix it? And he said, no need, we shoot the movie. And my favorite kind of director is a director who says, no need, we shoot the movie. But he said it so long and so often that he ended up finding another movie called Sheltering Sky, which he went off and made, so I lost Bernardo. Anyway, I then went through a series of directors, having written the script. But you know, directors like their own little hand marks on the script, put some thumbprints on this and that. And so between 8 and 10 directors that I discussed the script with, who all wanted to do it, and all had differing ideas, were all accommodated. So there are about 11 versions of the screenplay. And I could not get the studios to make a movie about chess. They simply said, no chess. Chess fails. And people kept making, every sort of 4 or 5 or 10 years, somebody made a chess movie which failed, just to prove them right. So one day having had a long blank period with studios, I got lucky and somebody called me and introduced himself to me and said he was called Heath Ledger. And he loved chess and he was an Australian junior chess champion. And would I consider him to direct the movies? Oh, what a good consider. So anyway, I went to New York and hung out with him a bit and we got to know each other and we liked each other. He was a lovely man, I mean, a really good guy. And by that time, he was no longer on alcohol or drugs or anything else. He was just a good, sensible guy with a nice wife, and I think their first child. And we really bonded on it. And he was in the middle of shooting, he'd finished shooting Batman and was just doing pickup shots and bits and pieces. And he wanted to hear the contemporary music from the period, i.e. 60s and 50s. And I spent a week putting together a whole reel for him to listen to these things and sent it to him. And he left for New York on the Wednesday, and on Friday he called me and he said, I love some of this stuff and some of it's such garbage. I can hardly believe you guys could listen to music like that. Anyway, we had a nice chat at about 6 o'clock in the evening, London time. And by midnight he was dead. He went to bed and took the wrong dosage or mixed the wrong pills. I don't know. And after he died, I just hadn't got the heart to go and hustle somebody else into doing it. So I left it for 3-4 years until out of the blue, the man who produced Searching for Bobby Fischer, who was a friend of mine, called me up and said, have you come across Scott Frank? And I said, yes. So we met, and the rest is Netflix history.
I mean, incredible Netflix history. But 30 years, 8 to 10 directors.
Well, you don't normally do that. I mean, normally the option dissuades you from doing it too much because you have to every year pay a sum of money. And in the case of this, Walter Tevis had long been dead when I acquired the option, but his widow or his agent said to me one day, we're not going to renew your option next year. And that meant that I had to trigger the option, which meant paying the buyout purchase price. And it was very substantial, but I'd had a good year and I paid it.
That's a big sign of belief. I mean, you say a
There's
substantial...
no question in my mind. I mean, when people ask me now, you know, what was it about the story of the book? It's so obvious when you think it through. It's a Victorian tale. It's about a child who's orphaned in the opening reel, who has no chance in life. She goes into she happens to have a talent for this game that a janitor is. And from there on, it's really about that girl's struggle. And it's a story of adversity being overcome. And I knew that all the chess games in it had to be their own separate kind of mini stories, because the audience wasn't going to follow a clever move where the rook goes to G4. So I needed other stories. For instance, will she get through this game? She's drank so much alcohol, it's coming out of her pores. And actually, I love that particular scene where they wake her up late to play the world champion.
It's one of my favourite bits. Brilliant, brilliant. So all these different stories within it, you could see, you believed that this was something that would work.
Yeah.
But the tenacity to keep going.
Well, it's partly tenacity and partly just getting it going. I mean, as soon as Scott was committed, it went pretty quickly. I mean, they wanted to work with Scott because he'd made a series that was a big success for them. And I wanted to work with Scott. And, you know, Scott's a writer primarily, or was a writer primarily, and me too. So we kind of knew how to work together, and we worked it out.
So again, you have a great team.
And great luck.
It must have felt incredible to finally be getting something made that you'd spent so long thinking about.
Gosh, I suppose so. Yes, I'm sure it did. No, I'm sure it did. The fact is, it felt like, at long last, I was getting made the movie that I cared about at that time. I mean, ask me right now, what's the favourite movie of the 23 that I've written?
What's your favourite movie of the 23 that you've written, Allan?
The next one. Because you can't write something unless you think it's going to be your favourite. And at the time that I was introduced to Scott, I was back in the trenches trying to get Queen's Gambit set up. So it was a cinch. It was my next movie. Boom.
Because you believed in it.
Yeah.
In the same way as you believed in the quality of the whiskey. So let's look at it both ways around. What do you think that your experience in the movie business has taught you when you think again about business and what's going on there? I mean, are there lessons for us who aren't in the movie business?
I think working in the movie business teaches you a higher quality of decision making. You learn what human pitfalls are. You learn how to identify the collaborators. I've never wanted to be a director, never.
Yeah.
And the reason is I'm just not willing to go into an actor's dressing room and beg them and persuade them to come out and read the line as it's written. Oh no, they think that character wouldn't say that line and they're not coming out of their dressing room until it's changed. Well, I'm not in that business. I'd rather work with people who find a way to do it.
Allan, you've had obviously times when you've taken time to get things right and other times when you've moved fast. How much do you think timing and luck have played a role in your life?
I mean, yes, of course, on some things you move quickly because you're in a competition, seen or unseen. But I think in the big things in life, you don't move that quickly because you need to be sure that the risk you're taking, and every project is a risk. I mean, if you're running a company where you're going to produce 30 ads, different ads this year, you better be sure that this one is as good as the last one or the next two. So you don't jump in that quickly.
What else then is there in common with everything you've been through in the movie business and with your experience in marketing and in business generally?
You know, in both cases, marketing and advertising and filmmaking and marketing of film are all the same. They're about clever people coming up with clever concepts.
But also what you're so great at doing clearly is building relationships with people relatively quickly, finding ways, whether it's just finding out their names or asking, as you've done with me, or I'm sure you've done with lots of other people, asking them about themselves and being curious about them. So I think that's a talent that surely is useful for anybody who's...
But if you're working in marketing and you're not skillful enough to ask people about themselves, get another job.
How do you feel about marketing? If your children or other people you came across said they wanted to work in
I think
marketing?
it's a very fulfilling life. I mean, I think it's really interesting. I love jobs like marketing and advertising where you're doing business and real business and at the same time you're doing creative things. I mean, anybody who thinks PR isn't creative is mistaken. Anybody who thinks that advertising is boring, I'm mistaken.
I'm reminded of the Ogilvy reference as well there again. You know, you can't bore people into buying your product. You can only interest them into buying it.
I think that's absolutely right. And one of the ways to do that is humour. There are only a limited number of topics for movies. All of them have to work on the emotional responses of their audiences. So you can do a love story, or you can do a terrible drama about death or dying or being trapped. But they have to be sufficient that the audience connects to those emotions. If you don't make an audience feel, you're going to get nowhere. And by the way, humor is one of the easiest things to get them to feel, which is why comedies are often the best of all the choices to make.
And why you had one of the many reasons you had such a success with the turnaround with Macallan, because you used humour to entertain people and
No,
get
and
their
that wasn't
attention.
my choice. That was bunches of people sitting in groups and coming up with notions. This not only will amuse an audience, it'll amuse us too. And I think people work better when they're doing something that they enjoy.
And we talked a lot about creativity, which is one of the sides of marketing, which is very important. What about understanding the commercial reality of things? Clearly, you've told me you're a terrible negotiator. I'll remember that for future reference. But in lots of other ways, you clearly have a very commercial brain. You understand that it's important in business to make money and make things happen. How do people get comfortable with understanding the commercial reality of business?
They get fired. Well, I mean, you're asking me how do they get comfortable in their job, in their role?
Yeah, or how do, I think it's often important in marketing and advertising, you get people who tend to get excited about the creative side of it all, and perhaps need to spend more time understanding what the implications of the commercial side of it
I once was invited to join a small, tiny company that was marketing or was looking at a new product. It was a brilliant product, I thought. I mean, one of those innovations that you think, that'll work. And we developed the product and we did everything we could. We didn't get to as far as advertising. But at an early stage, I said, we've got to do proper test marketing. We'll choose 3 cities around the country and we'll test market the product. And back came the results that 90% of the women, it was a product aimed at women, 90% of those to whom we showed it said they would definitely buy it. Mm-hmm. That's a hell of a high thing to get into.
Incredible result.
So we spent more money. And when we actually sold it, nobody bought it. And I think it was probably because we marketed it wrong. It was a dreary household product. Mm-hmm. And the job of your new person coming into marketing is to figure out the ways to sell that. You can do it by comedy. By the way, I think names and titles are incredibly important in marketing. Mm-hmm. I would, if your product isn't selling, start from the bottom and give it another name.
And how, when you look at the success of the Queen's Gambit, you talk about it being a timing point. Clearly it was a phenomenal product. Do you think there are certain elements that made it easier to sell to people and to capture their attention?
Yeah, we got lucky with having a wonderful director who was able to work with actors and was helpful to the actors. We had a wonderful set designer who built great period sets. We had a wonderful dressmaker, etc., etc. And we had a wonderful script. And we had wonderful concepts. Each scene was a concept. And as long as you do that, I don't see how you can fail, really.
We've talked a little bit about using influencers to try and spread the story about something and spread the message. It worked all those years ago with Macallan. We are now in such a different world where social media is the way to
I'm fascinated. I have friends who specialize in connecting Kim Kardashian with a product. And Kim Kardashian seems to make an awful lot of money out of this connection. I don't mean her literally, by the way. She was being spoken of metaphorically only. I like the idea
those who are
of metaphorical. Influencers.
Metaphorical Kim Kardashian.
Yeah, a metaphorical Kim Kardashian. And I thought, that's really interesting because you can target influencers with all those algorithms, so you can aim your product. Where in the old days, one of the problems I found at the whiskey company, at Macallan, we ended up taking out, I think they're called 40 sheets, those gigantic posters on the way to Heathrow and on the way into the tube station. And the trouble with that is it costs you an awful lot of money because they claim that they've got 400,000 eyes a week, 400,000 people pass it and look at it. And that's probably true, but of those, only 8 people drink whiskey. Or only 12 people, or only 2 people drink single. So you're paying, you can't target it, that's what I'm talking about.
But before you left, you really did do a phenomenal amount to help that business become the success.
Well, I hope so, and they've done very well.
What do you think other businesses, perhaps luxury brands, could learn from what Macallan has done?
Look, the way anybody makes a profit in business is you sell your product for more than it cost you to make. It's such an obvious statement, and you'd be astounded how many people don't believe it. My son has a restaurant in California. He opened it to great acclaim and closed it down 6 weeks later because COVID struck.
Oh, gosh.
He finally, a year later, has opened it again. And he's having a terrible struggle. The good people that he had are now getting jobs 4 times better than he could afford. And he's finding it very difficult to square the circle that the cost has to be lower and you still want the same audience coming in who afford this price range. It's all about margins and how much you've got available to you to sell, and then within the budget that you have available, sell it as best you can.
Well, I hope your son's restaurant
So do I,
is
yes.
successful. Does it have a good title? Does it have a good name?
It's called The Daisy.
The Daisy. And it's in California?
And it's in California, and it's fresh as a daisy.
Fantastic. So you still have an incredible amount of energy for new things. So, you know, making your own whiskey, getting involved in all kinds of new ventures. How do you keep your energy going, and how do you keep your creativity alive?
I think energy is actually eventually driven by your desire to participate. Mm-hmm. And I have an annoying desire to participate. I really do. And oddly enough, in other industries too. I mean, if somebody had told me that we were going to make chess sets sell at a high level with Queen's Gambit, I would have been in the chess business, chess set making business. But just because it's another challenge, how interesting to try it. I don't know, new things really do interest me. And taking an old, traditional, wonderful thing like a single malt whiskey and using modern methods to market it, that seems to be such a pleasant combination.
And then for you now, there is the new area to participate in, looking at new musicals. What's next?
Yeah, next I am doing 2 musicals, one of which was written, the lyrics are written by the man who wrote the lyrics for Les Miserables, a wonderful man called Herbert Kretzmer, who died, alas, last year. So I'm doing something that he and I worked on for a long time, which I hope will be good. I'm doing a big New York musical where I'm trying to persuade a very well-known composer who, as far as I'm aware, has never composed an opera, a musical. But I think I'm hoping to persuade him. We'll see.
You are very persuasive, so I'm sure you will succeed. The word gambit is, of course, a fascinating one, especially when we think about what you've done across your life and the risks that you have taken, the calculated risks that you've taken across your life. Do you think of yourself as a risk taker? Do you think of yourself as somebody who is prepared to, you know, open up conversations and make things happen?
I do not think of myself as a risk taker. I am also not a narcissist. But I think that sometimes I have good ideas about things, and I tend to believe in my good ideas. You have to. I mean, every act of writing is about creating something new. Every day of your life, of my life, I'm creating it. Somebody once asked me about it, and I said, you know, this very day, I have pulled down the temple of the Philistines, because I was writing the story of Samson and Delilah. I have crossed the mountains of China because I was writing about a woman. And I mean, and it's just every day a writer sits there conjuring worlds. And if you like the worlds you conjure, it's very hard to walk away from them.
Magical, that idea. If you were to go back and talk to your younger self, that, you know, if there was a dream sequence where you're able to do that, what would you tell yourself?
It would be boring to go through it with you, but it would essentially be take it more seriously.
Why?
Well, because I easily flip from one thing to another, and I would love to be somebody who thought deeply about something, and I'm not. I said to somebody the other day, "Don't look now, Priscilla, Regeneration, and Queen's Gambit. That's at least a career, you know."
Yes,
but in big 20-year jumps.
And also so different, so interesting, and also phenomenally successful.
Yeah, at least so different. Yeah.
Well, we come back to the word gambit. Of course, we now all know that it's used for the chess opener, but it's also used generally to mean an act or remark calculated to gain an advantage. And I think you have played some exceptional moves across your career, Allan.
Oh.
And many of them have been to your advantage, and definitely so many of them to our advantage. So thank you so much for bringing great entertainment, joy, and great whiskey to so many people. And thank you for all you've done today and talking to us, sharing your thoughts, probably getting some conversation started amongst everybody who
It's been fun.
Well, thank you. And I can't tell you what fun it was for me. So I hope that in the main it's been fun for you.
Thank you very much. It has. It has.